Well, would you look at this? A commentary video not on Steven Universe of all things. But it has been a while coming. You see, before Steven Universe, my first love was Nintendo. In fact, if you were here for my older videos, you'd see that all my videos had some form of Nintendo in them, in one way or another. It's probably because of how casual the games were, as well as how friendly they were. It felt like a safe haven in some places. But as I grew older and older, it just wasn't for me as much. Like, don't get me wrong, it's still in my top 3, with One Piece and Steven Universe taking up the other 2, but I don't really get as excited as I used to, with either the internet ruining things, or Nintendo themselves making a mix of good and bad decisions. Then again, the internet ruined both One Piece and Steven Universe for me, but in any case, EmpLemons. While he used to make YouTube poops, he evolved into making more intellectual videos, talking about meme culture and other stuff. In hindsight, some of his earlier intellectual videos had more than a few problems, but his mannerisms and astonishing editing hit those points and made them entertaining watches. Heck, you could attribute some of this as to why Shayfrolas is such a big hit, but they definitely took different paths video-wise. A lot of EmpLemons videos definitely go for being documentaries, as opposed to Shayfrolas who does reviews and whatnot. He did one on Nintendo and a lot of the negative things they've done, along with the fans that support them. And I'll just say that the first half of this video isn't bad. He talks about things like Nintendo of America hating Evo, and how it did what it could to stop the competitive scene, how Nintendo was really bad about distributing their properties to the point where it's also baffling as to why they hate emulation and ROM so much, and general content creators overall. But the second half? Oh boy, the second half.
The chain is only as strong as the weakest link.
A substantial portion of ROM sharing is done so out of necessity, by people who have no other means of obtaining games through legitimate methods. Obscurity, rights issues, and region locking make some titles remarkably difficult to acquire. When consumers are willing and able to pay for a product, it's up to existing services to fulfill those needs. When services fail to offer desired products, consumers have no choice but to obtain them through piracy or other black market means.
Alright, before we get into the nitty-gritty of everything, this is a minor point at the end of the day, and it's got basically nothing to do with the rest of my complaints, and it isn't even really that important. But Switch games get emulated despite being recent. Metroid Dread was emulated around 5 days after it was released, but everything else that you say about emulation is still pretty good. There's the fact that emulation can present better versions of games, the fact that they're more readily available, and so on and so forth.
Hey there, Kirby. Have you ever met a knight?
So have you ever noticed how most Nintendo YouTubers only seem to start popping into existence about 4 years ago? Well, there's a very important reason for that, because in the early 2010s, being a Nintendo YouTuber was completely infeasible. Last year, Google Stadia creative director Alex Hutchinson posted a tweet suggesting that streamers and content creators pay a fee to game publishers for the privilege of having others watch them play. This post got absolutely ratioed out of the ballpark. I mean, really, what a totally asinine statement. Can you actually imagine how dystopian it would be if companies actually did this? Except, one company has done this, Nintendo. So in 2015, they sheepishly restored content creators' ability to earn revenue, this time taking a 30% cut. However, in order to get your 70% share, you were forced to manually apply to their partner program so they could micromanage your channel and make sure that you didn't step out of line from their standards. This policy persisted for more than 3 years before Nintendo finally scrapped it and allowed content creators to do what literally every other game publisher was fine with the whole time. If EA or Blizzard or Sony or Epic Games did just some of the things Nintendo do on a regular basis, you'd never hear the end of it. What makes Nintendo any different? How do they keep getting away with it?
I don't get your metric. What do you mean, Nintendo getting away with it? Nintendo has consistently been criticized for their copyright shenanigans. First, it's because they don't offer an alternative way to get their soundtracks. Several people have complained about Gilva Sunner and the Brawl Burstum being taken down due to copyright strikes. And then there's how it screws with its creators. A lot of content creators back in the day complained about it, from Zack Scott Games, to Northern Lion, Max Gonzalez, and so many more, hence why the creators program was made in the first place. To be fair, it wasn't perfect. In fact, like you say, it's absolute buffoonery, and that's why people still complain and criticize Nintendo over it, from Stephanie Sterling, to Angry Joe, to Donkey, and even PewDiePie himself, to the point where it was gotten rid of. Saying they keep getting away with it is completely and utterly false. In fact, we never heard the end of it, as of course, it was brought up and complained about ad nauseum.
Well, the main difference between Nintendo and all of these other companies comes down to one factor: the fans. They're confident that they can get away with almost anything, because a substantial portion of their audience have adopted the dogmatic belief that the company is incapable of sin. Recently, there have been prevailing discussions online about the toxicity of fandoms and stan culture, and while the same few notorious subcultures get brought up over and over again, I rarely see anyone mention the Nintendo fandom in these conversations. In my experience, the most extreme Nintendo fans are as psychotic and maladjusted as any other fandom, and I'm tired of pretending that they're not.
Well, time to bring out this icebreaker again. Don't judge the fandom by the most extreme examples. Not everyone in MLP puts Rainbow Dash in the jar. Not everyone in the Sonic fanbase is Chris Chan. And not everyone in the Star Wars fanbase is a bitter anti-SJW who wants to remake The Last Jedi. Oh wait, do you mean that the extreme in Nintendo's fanbase is as bad as the extreme in any other fanbase? Well, no shit. It's almost like crazy people exist everywhere.
I always imagine that Nintendo doesn't have to pay a PR team to run damage control because their fans will do it for them. It seems that no matter how low the company stoops, it will always have a human shield of fanboys lining up to make excuses for them. The most diehard fans are so quick to forget about the company's misdeeds that you'd think they have amnesia. At the end of last year, Nintendo got into some hot water. In the span of a few weeks, they shut down Melee's biggest online event, shut down a Splatoon tournament when those players stood in solidarity with the Melee players, and shut down the charitable sale of Joy-Cons honoring the late Etika. 3 days later, they unveiled Sephiroth in Ultimate, and all the backlash magically disappeared. When I pointed this out on Twitter, I spent the next week getting bombarded with apoplectic responses of how much of an idiot I was for thinking that Nintendo fans would actually express displeasure to the company.
Okay, now we see where this whole tangent came from. It'd be easy to say that he added this part to defend a bad tweet he made, so I will. This is a bad tweet not worth defending. You see, the premise of this tweet is weird, especially what you brought up before. You see, your first point was about the lack of support Nintendo has for fighting game tournaments or fan-made content. It can be seen with the fact that unlike something like League of Legends or Pokemon, tournaments aren't discussed or shown anywhere on the official Nintendo channel, as official Nintendo events rarely happen. But using that, the lack of intersectionality between using Nintendo YouTube videos and the Smash community debunks your point here, especially since a lot of them are independent like you said. You see, anyone who's a fan of Nintendo's YouTube wouldn't know anything about fan games being shut down or tournament drama unless someone else in the Nintendo community makes a post about it. But the chance of someone seeing that video, as opposed to an official video by Nintendo, is slim, especially when Nintendo doesn't mention anything about tournaments and so on, and especially since YouTube's algorithm doesn't really enable this intersectionality between the average Nintendo fan and anything regarding fan games or tournaments or that much. Second off, your evidence is the like-dislike ratio of Smash reveals, neither of which correlate to any specific mention of either tournaments or fan games, but instead are supposed to show how Nintendo's fans actually act. This is the only evidence given towards how Nintendo's fans give up all ill will towards the company and how they suddenly don't care about Etikons or free Melee, and this bites you in the ass hard. And finally, you ignore the fact that Nintendo supported the Big House tremendously, but the usage of the Slippy mod to play online was the thing that didn't sit well. Like sure, you can get mad at Nintendo for being so litigious, especially with a mod for a 20-year-old game that they don't even sell anymore. You could even get mad that they cancelled Ultimate, even if it had nothing to do with the Slippy mod itself. But this point right here kind of breaks your premise of deliberately sabotaging their esports scene, as if they didn't support the Big House.
Wow, what an awful take. How foolish of me. When have people ever protested the company's recent actions by pressing dislike on their totally unrelated YouTube videos? Well, actually, October 2019, Blizzard bans Hearthstone player Blitzchung for making pro-Hong Kong comments. Their subsequent unrelated YouTube videos are heavily disliked.
Funny thing about that though, did you know that they actually directly responded to it here? You see, this was talked about in regards to the free Hong Kong discussions, while Hong Kong protesters were outside.
November 2018, Fallout 76 launches as a buggy, unplayable disaster. Bethesda gets ratioed on unrelated videos. November 2017, EA reveals much-hated loot crates will be a part of Battlefront 2. Ratio. August 2016, No Man's Sky grossly underdelivers upon release. Ratio. Now where did I get this absolutely bonkers idea again?
These last three examples illustrate a bigger problem with gaming discourse overall, like ignoring the fact that these aren't really that big of a ratio, due to the fact that viewership isn't really that high for these videos, but all of them were a result of shitty quality of the games, rather than shitty practices as companies. A big example of this comes with Pokemon. While Bring Back National Dex spread far and wide, within those same people, there's less concern about how Game Freak is forced to push it out by the Pokemon company. In fact, there are still people that blame Nintendo for it, or even Game Freak themselves. And no matter what the case, Bring Back National Dex is still more popular, more memorable, and more focused on than the crunch of Game Freak. It's also why Gen 8 Pokemon videos got disliked around release, even though said videos don't mention the Dex cut. Gamers all across the board do this, and I'm not saying Nintendo and their fans don't suffer from this problem, because they really do. But you can't attribute this to only a Nintendo thing, or say that it gets excused because of the fans. Along with this, none of this had to do specifically with community backlash, like with Activision Blizzard. So while this does prove a point, it's just not the one that you were aiming for exactly. Also, keep in mind that the games and announcements that are brought up in these videos did not and will not get nearly as much attention as something like Sephiroth and Smash Brothers. You know, Smash Brothers, the crossover fighting game with the most exciting roster in the history of games, for all of its crossovers from Nintendo franchises and beyond. The one that broke Twitter when Steve was announced. There was no way that the previously mentioned lack of intersectionality wouldn't trump free melee, or even make a mild ratio dent.
I was never trying to argue that spamming dislikes on developer videos is an effective means of instigating change. I'm not even arguing that it's justifiable. My point with all of this was that ratioing videos is a simple and direct way for consumers to publicly express their disapproval towards a company.
I addressed this point before, but let me say it again. There's a significant lack of intersectionality between people who watch Nintendo's YouTube's official videos and people who are a part of Nintendo's fan communities. Also, you really can't blame these commenters for getting this message from your tweet. In that tweet, you equated the approval of Nintendo and or outrage towards the company with likes and or dislikes. That's what was explicitly done, as no other evidence was provided towards this. Given this, what would be the best way to show your disapproval for the company according to you? Giving more dislikes. And did you know that massive dislikes because of disapproval of a company's actions rather than the content of the video itself is called dislike bombing?
Punch Buggy, stop it, Luigi. You know I bruise like a peach.
The notable absence of dislikes on Nintendo's video after the controversy says to me that the backlash never really existed.
Nintendo's video.
All that hemming and hawing in the moment was superficial and couldn't have reflected anyone's true convictions.
Alrighty, I can get where you might see hypocrisy, but there's one big difference between your post and their post. One of them was a ratio on Twitter, and the other was a ratio on YouTube. I already addressed how the algorithm of YouTube makes intersectionality harder than it would be normally, but Twitter is very good at this kind of intersectionality. The most notable difference is the use of the trending page. You see, Twitter's design is set up so that if something that's relevant to you is trending, you could see it on the right side of the screen, along with a description of what's trending and why it's trending. YouTube doesn't do that, and if you do want to see it, you need to click to a separate tab. A smaller one would be the fact that you could see tweets and retweets of your friends on the Twitter homepage itself, and if they're interested in a certain topic, you can see their reactions to it. For YouTube, you have to go out of your way to see the videos that people have liked and commented on. Another small one is hashtags. While YouTube has integrated hashtag usage recently, Twitter's where it reigns supreme. For all these reasons, and probably a bit more that I didn't mention, you could see a better statistic and better instances of outrage through Twitter, such as the one on the left, compared to the one on the right that doesn't really make sense.
Because the second Nintendo jangled a shiny set of keys in front of the fans, everyone seemed to forgive and forget.
First things first, I want to note this point right here, because it's going to come back later. But second, I'm going to wait a little bit for another point, but I just want you to know, in fact I want everyone to know, that you can have different feelings for a company's business practices of a business, and with a business's products. I'll elaborate more on it on the next point though.
The Nintendo Brigade was quick to jump down my throat to lecture me about how a video posted to Nintendo's YouTube channel featuring a best-selling Nintendo franchise somehow exists irrespective to Nintendo as a business.
Jeez, this is a brain-dead point. Oh, no, not the comment, but EmpLemons' point. Because what you do for decisions in a game is not equivalent to business decisions in general. This is like saying that the recent revival of Crash Bandicoot has a connection with the mistreatment of employees at Activision Blizzard. Because they're both Activision business decisions.
Hello there, Nintendo. I would like to put Sephiroth from Final Fantasy VII into my fighting game.
Yes, that should be fine.
Why are you destroying that Smash Bros. Tournament?
Because we put Sephiroth in Smash. This is how business decisions work.
Many try to make the complete non-sequitur argument that disliking a YouTube video is somehow equivalent to taking food off of Sakurai's dinner plate, with one person comparing Sakurai to a hapless Walmart employee.
Okay, so that's how it's gonna be. Y'all wanna play?
Ignoring the fact that this post isn't even directed at Sakurai.
Huh, would you look at that? An explanation. Remember the how sincere point from before? Well, this shows exactly the reason why he can have these opinions back to back. Like, you can hate Activision Blizzard, but still have a soft spot for Crash Bandicoot whenever he shows up. It's not a lack of sincerity of conflicting opinions to do so, and acting like it is bullshit. But sure, you never suggested it. I'm following.
Trying to frame him as an independent bystander to the big bad legal team above him is painfully naive and factually wrong. Executor. Nintendo is starting to resemble a tyrant that's gone mad with power, and their draconian disregard for the public good runs a hell of a lot deeper than a couple of bad apples on their legal team. Every decision any company makes comes straight from the top, and as hard as it may be for some of you to believe, Sakurai is a hell of a lot closer to the top than the alternative.
You've gotta be kidding me, right? Okay, it doesn't matter how close someone is to the top still makes the decisions. You know what this is? Do you know what this exact logic is? Blame Rebecca Sugar logic. I'm not kidding. This is exactly like blaming Rebecca Sugar for the hiatuses in Steven Universe, and saying that since she's so close to the top, she should bear some responsibility for those hiatuses, despite the fact that the decision wasn't made by her, and was instead made by Cartoon Network executives. If you replace Rebecca Sugar with Sakurai, CN executives with Nintendo executives, and hiatuses with enacting free Melee, you get something eerily similar. Hell, if you wanted to, it even applies more so to the Splatoon 2 tournament being cancelled, and Edicons being shut down for similar reasons, especially since Sakurai doesn't even have a hand in the creation of either of those things.
Lots of people try to obfuscate his role in the company by stipulating that he is not technically a Nintendo employee. This point is completely irrelevant when you consider how Sakurai's actions directly influenced the bottom line of the company, and how his entire career trajectory was dictated by Nintendo's success.
I mean, sure, there's a connection, like that's completely correct, but it's semantic at best. Also, just because there is some correlation between Sakurai and the top legal people at Nintendo, it doesn't mean that there's causation. In fact, that's probably the biggest problem with this whole section. I'll get into more examples of it, but here's a good one. Just because there's a correlation between Sora and Nintendo, it doesn't mean that Nintendo's decisions on what to do with the competitive Smash scene is caused by either Sora or Sakurai, or even condoned by them.
He is the spokesperson for Super Smash Bros. By definition, he represents the views of the company.
Hello?
Just like those oh-so-nefarious lawyers, it is his job to toe the company line.
I'm sorry, let's go back a bit. Remember when he said that Nintendo owns a majority of Sakurai's company? Let me say it again if you didn't remember it. Nintendo owns a majority of Sakurai's company. Therefore, he can't really make any official statements on Nintendo's channel or anywhere near Nintendo without it having to be checked by Nintendo. If Nintendo is monitoring what you say or what you do, then how the heck can you make your own choices against them without suffering consequence in this case?
He oversaw two of Nintendo's flagship franchises for decades. He had the opportunity to make Smash better for competitive players, and he didn't.
When watching this ending part of the video, I did get mad frequently, but throughout all of it, I thought to myself, maybe I'm just fanboying over Nintendo too much, and I'm just getting annoyed for no reason. And in that case, I would be proving his point about how Nintendo fans are garbage or whatever. When I got to this point, however, I stopped the video and laughed. First off, fuck you for using an out-of-context quote of Sakurai to paint him as someone who hates Smash being in the competitive fighting community, or just the competitive fighting community in general. If you don't know, or haven't seen the earlier part of the video, this referred to Brawl when comparing it to Melee, which brings us the part that cracks me up the most. The fact that he ignores any changes in Smash 4 or Ultimate that Sakurai made to appeal to the competitive fighting scene after Brawl. What changes were those? Well, Smash 4 introduced a punishment system for quitting during the middle of a match, as well as separating Smash modes for ones with people who want to do things for fun, and for glory. It also introduced Omega stages, making it so that you have the aesthetic of a stage you like without having any of the annoying gimmicks or platforms. Random tripping was removed, and tourneys were added. Smash Ultimate introduced Elite Smash, a system where being the best let you play against more powerful players. A massive gameplay overhaul, including introducing directional dodging, and the introduction of stale moves, making spamming less favorable, and added battlefield stages. Both games have consistent patches to keep up with and update the meta for the characters to keep them balanced. You can argue their effectiveness, sure, but efforts were made to make Smash better for competitive players. Gee golly gosh though, I guess Sakurai said that he felt Melee was too technical once, and therefore he means that for all the games, especially for the ones that he's working on. Once again, however, the fact that Sakurai said this, and that competitive Smash is being screwed by Nintendo, does not mean that Sakurai would, by extension, be 100% okay with this.
He had the opportunity to speak out against Nintendo's increasingly slimy business decisions, and he didn't.
Assuming that he actually knows about free Melee, since you presented no evidence that he himself actually does, the best case scenario to this is that Nintendo would improve, and that's nice and everything, but you also went on and on earlier about how Nintendo hides behind their legality as a company to do things, rather than their ethical nature. So it could be reasonable to assume that this best case scenario doesn't happen. Not trying to be a pessimist, but since Sora is a separate company, despite Nintendo's majority ownership, they could easily cut ties with them like that, instead of fixing anything, and therefore nothing would ever change. But if the people at Sora are really Nintendo's employees, then unfortunately Sakurai doesn't really have any way to retaliate against them or seek justice. In the case he does get cut off, even if he tried to go for a whistleblowing case, A, the legal rights of Nintendo would be more supported than the ethical rights of people playing Melee, and B, even if that did get through, Nintendo is not obligated to compensate anyone, nor change in terms of their behavior, making it a moot point at the end of the day, unfortunately. As a side note, this only applies because these are the Japanese standards of whistleblowing in terms of bad work practices. There's not really a reasonably happy ending, since, especially like you said before, they keep getting away with it.
To claim in any way that Sakurai somehow exists in a vacuum, completely free of Nintendo's influence, demonstrates a complete ignorance towards the nature of business.
And assuming the inverse, by assuming that he exists in Nintendo's bubble and absorbs everything and anything about Nintendo stuff, is also a complete ignorance towards the nature of business. Kinda like what those tweets say. This is the main problem in treating the correlation between Sakurai and Nintendo as a causality immediately.
But hey, who am I to dare commit sacrilege against one of Nintendo's prodigal sons? If Nintendo is God, Sakurai and all their other spokespeople are Jesus Christ, and have been idolized as such. You're not allowed to criticize them, and you're especially not allowed to undermine their supreme authority. When Nintendo does all that anti-consumer stuff, they're just operating within their fair and justifiable legal right. But pressing dislike on a Sakurai video, now that's just cruel. Who would even consider doing such a thing? I was never trying to argue that spamming dislikes on developer videos is an effective means of instigating change. I'm not even arguing that it's justifiable.
What happened to not making this point?
11 months before this, the Nintendo fandom actually decided to make use of the dislike button to protest the addition of Byleth to Smash Ultimate, and they didn't seem to be too concerned over Sakurai's feelings here. Blatant double standards aside, it's somewhat enlightening to realize where the Nintendo fandom's priorities actually lie.
Remember when I brought up the point earlier about how people share more hatred towards a game's quality rather than the unethical or shady business practices? Yeah, nothing has changed, so I don't know why you think they did.
Complaining about an optional DLC sword fighter in a game with 80 other characters. I can't help but think that some of these people exist in Neverland. Tangible problems in our world don't concern them. Only when their whimsical wonderland is disrupted do they show the slightest signs of resistance. Fortunately for Nintendo, pacifying the mob is as simple as unveiling the next shiny new toy. And therein lies the ultimate problem. There was once a time where enough people would object to Nintendo's decisions and the company could actually be convinced to listen. Now we've reached a point where the militant worship of the company is drowning out dissenting voices in practically all cases of controversy. All of us are left to reap the consequences of a company who knows their audience will tolerate anything they do as long as the product on screen is good enough. They can charge $20 a year for a barely functional online service that was free on prior systems. They can charge $80 for controllers with such significant defects that they make many games borderline unplayable. They can release reskins of games that cost more than the originals. They can arbitrarily limit the release window of games for no other reason than to jack up the price. They can force customers to purchase an additional console if they want to create a second island in Animal Crossing. At what point will Nintendo cross the line to where the customer is no longer willing to get ripped off? Fortunately, Nintendo has the most loyal fans in the world, and that line is nowhere in sight.
Ah yes, because nobody complains about these. I know because I checked the dislike ratio and no one had a problem with that. Ha 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 ha. If there's one thing to note from this, there's a lot to hate Nintendo about right now. A lot to hate about Nintendo. A lot of it is justified too, but make sure to know when something's uncalled for. Research is important, but combining the research and coming up with reasonable conclusions based on that research is also important. It's also important not to combine it with your own personal thoughts or experiences, unless your research shows how relevant it is. To be fair, Emplemon did this on a basic level. He built on information with the personal experience he had and tried to support it. However, it's clear that it was either selective, given all of his research, not detailed enough in some areas, or it just didn't fit together in others. It's like Super Size Me, a documentary about how unhealthy McDonald's is, that, while proving a well-known and well-researched point, goes about doing so in the worst faith way possible, with 6 meals a day and a refusal to exercise, massively skewing known data. A lot of this video has logic that just doesn't connect in a lot of places when uncovering what Emplemon said previously, like trying to say that Sakurai could just leave or rebel against Nintendo's practices moments after saying that Nintendo most likely owns Sora, and they use legality to their advantage. The main case of this comes with the extensive amount of causations that Emplemon pins on correlations. Because there wasn't a big movement in regards to Nintendo's ridiculous copyright laws, it means that Nintendo is full of bootlickers who are completely okay with Nintendo, their insane copyright laws, and letting them get away with it. Because the Smash reveal trailers don't have a significant amount of dislikes, it means that Nintendo fans don't don't care about free Melee or the competitive scene. Because Sakurai said this one quote about Brawl in regards to Melee, it means that he wants to crush the competitive scene, or is at least okay with Nintendo doing so. And if you try to present any evidence of the fact that you didn't do any of this, then you did jack shit to prove it. Okay, I promise the next video won't be a ranty video. Hopefully.